Hi, I'm Cetinkaya Rundel. I'm going to spend the next 5 or so minutes reflecting on teaching version control. But I should first start by saying that these reflections don't just belong to me. We've been working on a paper on implementing version control with Git as a learning objective in statistics courses over the past few months. And these are really ideas that we've kind of gathered together based on our experiences and reflections on doing this over the past few years. And you can find the paper on arXiv as well. So the first thing that's really important to mention here is that if you are going to be teaching version control, start slowly and keep it simple. For example, if you're teaching in the context of R in RStudio, limit students' Git interactions to the RStudio IDE. In rare circumstances where this is not sufficient, offer help and narrate your process to make it a teachable moment for your students. Use class time for the first exposure to thorny experiences like merge conflicts, doing these in a controlled environment where you can actually help out the students, and especially where they know that an error is coming up and that they're going to have to deal with it and they have precise instructions for how to do so is very, very useful. Ultimately, decide on the scope of learning goals for your course and build up to more complex ideas like branching, pull requests, etc. These are not things that are going to happen on day one or even week one, and realistically, they may never happen at all, especially if you're teaching an introductory course where this is the first exposure of students to computing and version control. Don't feel like you have to cover all of this. You can still teach them a very useful workflow without some of the more advanced aspects of version control. On the assessment side, we talk quite often about the commit history of students being transparent. Number of commits is actually not a great measure of achievement or learning, but 0 is a very informative number. And you can use this number to identify students who are really not engaging with the course material very early on in your course. You can also supplement any sort of commit history with peer feedback, especially if you are using teamwork in your course. It's useful to get the perspective from peers in written form as well. And if you are going to be teaching version control, it's important to assess it as well. So we would recommend something like allocating roughly 10% of grades for each assessment to checking things like reasonable number of commits, reasonable commit content, meaningful commit messages, and organization of the repository. And ultimately, it's really important to model good version control hygiene before actually assessing it. So do not hesitate to be incredibly prescriptive in early assignments. So you can even tell students, when to make a commit and exactly what to say in the commit message. You do this a few times and then they're really going to pick up the ropes, and then you can take away the scaffolding in later assignments. Another thing we talk about often is students ending up with a GitHub profile based on their coursework as a benefit associated with teaching tools like GitHub. But it's important to note that this is not an automatic win. Everything could be public, but nothing really has to be. And in fact, you probably want your student work to be living in private repositories for privacy concerns. But even if students emerge from your course with 0 public artifacts, they have still learned a lot, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind. A good public repository has a rich but brief README, it's well organized, and optionally maybe uses the GH Pages branch to serve the README as a website. So if you are going to be offering your students to option to have public repositories at the end of your course, it's really useful to build assignments that will result in checking these boxes of having the rich README and as well organized to begin with. We talk about GitHub in the context of teaching with version control. Why GitHub? There are a few reasons for this. First is reach. It is more widely used than other web hosting version control platforms like GitLab and Bitbucket. It has a really rich API, which allows for tools like GitHub Classroom and the GH class package to function so that they can actually help you as the instructor to manage your course on GitHub. It has this continuous integration feature called GitHub Actions. It's a newer feature, but it is free to use for educational purposes, and you can use that for immediate feedback and auto-grading of files by triggering certain code to run in the background every time students push to their repositories. There are, however, some challenges as well. Data privacy is one of these. Student code is always hosted on GitHub servers, so this is something to keep in mind, and there are some ways around this. The educational support is currently free. You can have unlimited free repositories. There's no reason to suspect that this is going to go away anytime soon, but it could, and I think it's really useful to keep in mind when you're relying on a free service to build an entire curriculum around it. The good news is that many people are doing this, and there's a lot of great open source educational content out there that even if things were to change, it seems like people are going to be keeping this up, even if you don't want to be the producer of this new educational content. There may also be some ethical reasons as well. There was recently a campaign to asking GitHub to drop their contract with ICE. So I think this sort of stuff is useful to keep in mind. And even if it doesn't mean you change away from using GitHub, it might be useful to actually discuss with your students and bring these up in the classroom, so they don't just stumble upon it and think that you've completely ignored this aspect of things. So to wrap things up, if you're thinking, can I teach version control? I really have 3 questions for you. Do you feel comfortable with, and I don't mean master of, just comfortable with Git and GitHub? If not, I strongly recommend the Happy Git with R book by Jenny Bryan. I think that giving that a go once and then asking yourself this question will be a great idea. And I think that then you will be saying yes to that. The next question is, do you or other course staff have the bandwidth to offer personalized help when needed? This could be live, but it could also be just answering questions on a discussion forum. But students might get themselves into situations where you may need to offer help personally. And ultimately, are you willing to troubleshoot on the spot and or say, I don't know, let's figure this out together? Because a lot of working with Git is actually Googling your way around things, and you do need to come to it. You do need to be prepared to do this along with your students, unless you yourself are a master of Git to begin with. But if you are able to say yes to these questions, I think the answer is yes, you can teach version control.